In this last one, I wanted to discuss all the topics in which I had previously discussed with my fellow pilgrims. I wanted to thank them also for making this project so great. It would probably not have turned out as well as it did without their help. So I really want to thank them. I know their schedules are busy. So them taking time out of their lives to help me with the final project, I'm really thankful for that. So, just a quick recap on all of the topics in which we talked about. In Sarah Grace's episode, we discussed the Catholic imagination. We began with the idea that God is present in the material world and how this idea is central to Catholic thought. Catholicism does not treat the physical world as something separate from God or opposed to spiritual life. Catholicism sees creation as capable of revealing God. So this idea is so essential to Catholic life, and we see that in churches and relics and in the sacramental life and in holy sites like Rome and in bodies and in the communion of saints and in ordinary human experience. And so we also discussed the Catholic both and framework brought forth by Aristotle with his hylomorphic views and this idea that humans and ultimately everything, including transubstantiation, both the soul, the essence of it, and also the physical body of what it is. So these ideas are central to Catholic thought, and it resists the either or categories because faith is both spiritual and physical, and it is also both personal and communal and is both historical and divine. So this both and framework really helps explain why pilgrimage matters so much in the Catholic life. It's not just suffering, it's not just spiritual significance, it's both. So I think it really explains how pilgrimage matters and why it matters so much in the Catholic faith and in the Catholic imagination. This leads into Olivia's episode where we discuss scripture, tradition, and authority. In that conversation, we talked about what the canon means, who has the authority to define it, and how Catholics understand the relationship between scripture and tradition. In that episode, we discussed a lot about Martin Luther. We discussed major themes of Catholicism and how scripture is sacred and authoritative, but it's also received and interpreted and preserved within tradition. And so this matters in Catholic life because the canon is not just a question about which books belong in the Bible, it's a question about authority ultimately. So who decides what counts as scripture? Well, ultimately, the church uses the both and approach. Once again, scripture matters, but so does tradition. Individual faith matters, but so does communal authority. So although that scripture is important, it's also important to trust what the church says and what tradition says. And so this connects to pilgrimage because pilgrimage is deeply dependent on trust and tradition. A holy site is meaningful because of tradition and the ways in which the church has remembered it and preserved it and how they've prayed there and passed down its significance. So Rome is a great example of holy site in which the and both framework is utilized. In Emmanuel's episode, we discussed Jesuit tradition and Ignatian spirituality, especially here at Georgetown. We talked about how Ignatian spirituality can be encountered not just in theory but in real life. One of the main things I take from Jesuit spirituality is orienting yourself towards God. It's not just about knowing religious ideas, it's about using them in your real life. And this theme is very important in Catholic pilgrimage. I mean, pilgrimage itself is deeply Ignatian, but it's also about the journey. And this theme of Jesuit spirituality is really important in Catholic pilgrimage. I mean, Ignatian spirituality emphasizes pilgrimage a lot. We read Ignatian's autobiography. I feel like that really emphasized pilgrimage. And so Ignatian spirituality asks people to reflect on their experiences and, orient yourself towards God. And even though, like here at Georgetown, we talk through phrases like cura personalis, faith that does justice, and finding God in all things, I think Emmanuel's episode really helped show that these ideas are not just slogans. It's ways in which we implement and see the world through God and how we can see God within the material world and how it's not just superstition, but how we can really use our Jesuit background, Jesuit education to see the significance of the Catholic imagination within our daily lives. In Marco's episode, we talked about sin, grace, and freedom, which adds another layer to this. We talked a lot about God's omnipotent and omnipresent divine will and how we can reconcile that with human freedom. We also discussed things like sin a lot. We talked about how sin is not necessarily your own interpretation of what sin means, but also there's room for context within seeing what sin is. God doesn't see things in a vacuum, and even if he did, God is a forgiving God and insists that grace is present and that freedom still matters. Even if God is all powerful and present in all things, humans still have the ability to choose because they operate within God's will. We were given free will by God, and so he allows us that autonomy. It does not necessarily remove agency from the human being. In Emily's episode, we discussed the sacramental worldview, and it kind of brought us back to the ideas of Catholic faith in the real world. So, in that episode, we discussed holy orders, apostolic succession, infant baptism, transubstantiation, as well as supersessionist views on Judaism. These are huge theological topics, which we were barely able to scrape the surface of, but we really discussed how the importance of infant baptism, what transubstantiation actually means, the ideas of apostolic succession and the history and continuity of the church, and then also how people interpret things like John's gospel to be anti Semitic and supersessionist. But in reality, the Catholic faith has a lot of influence and a lot of power in the world, and I think it's important to interpret scripture accordingly and accurately. This connects again to pilgrimage because of that and or framework, but also because the idea of the universality of the Eucharist, of Mass, of transubstantiation. If you go to a church in where I'm from, the middle of nowhere, Washington State, it'll be the same thing as if you were to go to Mass in Rome, or if you're going to Mass at Dahlgren. It's ultimately the same. And finally, in Stefan's episode, we discussed how Rome is a holy site, and it brought a lot of these themes together. We discussed that Rome is an epicenter of Catholic faith, and we discussed the continuity of the church, its historical and spiritual significance, and the role of Baroque architecture and Counter-Reformation efforts. These ideas are really important to pilgrimage because, first of all, we went to Rome, and it can feel overwhelming and excessive because it gathers so many parts of Catholic life into one place. It contains historical significance, it contains doctrinal authority, it contains papal authority, it contains beauty, all these things, even politics, prayer, and the power, the institutional power that the church itself has. It contains all these things, and it's all located within one city. So I think that all of these, ideas relate to pilgrimage in very distinct but yet unified ways. Pilgrimage is a Catholic thought in motion. It is Catholic imagination lived through the body. It is tradition encountered through place. It is sacramentality. It is experience through the senses. It's freedom through discomfort and reflection. This was a completely voluntary choice to go on a pilgrimage. It is communion with the saints made more concrete. You got to interact with real saints. You got to see them. You got to see their relics. And finally, it's a reminder that the Christian life itself is a journey toward God. So, as I'm kind of wrapping up, I think the question is not only what we learned about Catholicism, it's about the question of what Catholicism teaches us to see. I think Catholicism teaches us to see the world as meaningful, the body as part of faith, history as alive, tradition as formative, and grace as present, even in ordinary things. I think that a lot of this is seeing God in all things. In that sense, pilgrimage does not really end where the trip ends. The physical journey is over, sure, we're back home, we're back in DC, but the deeper journey, I think, continues longer than just the pilgrimage. Catholic life asks us to keep on walking, to keep discerning, and to keep learning how to recognize God in all things.